There are two different accounts for how the remake for King Kong came about. In December 1974, Michael Eisner, then an executive for ABC, watched the original film on television and struck the idea for a remake. He pitched the idea to Barry Diller, the chairman and CEO of Paramount Pictures, who then enlisted veteran producer Dino De Laurentiis to work on the project. However, De Laurentiis claimed the idea to remake King Kong was solely his own when he saw a Kong poster in his daughter's bedroom as he woke her up every morning. When Diller suggested doing a monster film with him, De Laurentiis proposed the idea to remake King Kong. Diller and De Laurentiis provisionally agreed that Paramount would pay half of the film's proposed $12 million budget in return for the distribution rights in the United States and Canada if the former could purchase the film rights of the original film. De Laurentiis later contacted his friend Thomas F. O'Neill, president of General Tire and RKO General, who informed him that the rights for the film were indeed available. Later, De Laurentiis and company executive Frederick Sidewater entered formal negotiations with Daniel O'Shea, a semi-retired attorney for RKO General, who requested a percentage of the film's gross. On May 6, 1975, De Laurentiis paid RKO General $200,000 plus a percentage of the film's gross. After finalizing the agreement with Paramount, De Laurentiis and Sidewater began meeting with foreign distributors and set the film's release for Christmas in John Guillermin's 1976 film, King Kong.
You know, I had my horoscope done before I flew out to Hong Kong.
Watch your step.
And it said that I was...
Okay, here you go. Up.
And it said that I was going to cross over water and meet the biggest person in my life.
Let them fight. You're a wizard, Harry.
You're gonna need a bigger boat. I'll be back.
Death has come to your little town, June.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Chills and Thrills. My name is Connor, and as always, I'm back here with Chris doing another episode for the King Kong film franchise. Today, we're doing a film that I watched on repeat continuously as a youngster. We're doing the 1976 remake of King Kong. And like I said, this was a film I watched on repeat. I was constantly renting it. We had a family video a couple blocks from home, so I would, at 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, whatever it might have been, I was jumping on my bike. I had a little mongoose with the pegs and all that good stuff back in the day, and I'd hop on that bad boy and cruise over to the family video, and I'd always look for the Friday the 13th, the Halloweens, and stuff like that. And this is something I always rented. I would end up bringing it back home, and my mom would look at me and be like, "Didn't you just rent that 2 weeks ago?" And it's like, well, what do you want from me? I like this movie. I enjoy this movie a lot. And this is what got me into King Kong. I'm not 100% sure, but I think I seen this film before I seen the Japanese King Kong vs. Godzilla. But this is one of the films that I definitely have a lot of fun with. So, Chris, I know you said you haven't watched it for a while before this rewatch for the podcast. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. When I was a little guy, I thought this was the old King Kong. That was my first, like, I thought this was the original when I was that young, a very little guy. This was probably the I guess the second one I saw after King Kong versus Godzilla, I would say. Maybe I saw parts of this before. That's hard to say. But later, of course, I learned that there was a black and white one and all that. I loved it as a kid, and it's sort of one of those movies where after I was a kid, I probably watched it once every 10 years or so. You go back and watch it when the 2005 movie comes out. You go back and watch it kind of, when Kong Skull Island's going to come out, that sort of a thing. And I like it. It's a little bit of a mixed bag. Like for almost it's not that it's an overall okay movie, but it's almost for all the stuff that it does like really well or really uniquely or in a really cool way. it kind of has some things that are kind of awkward and kind of odd, and so it's like it's got these highs and it's got these lows, but overall it's a really like, you know, there's not a large supply of 70s giant monster movies, and it's a, and you know, it's a good take, and it has a lot of cool stuff for you know, being from that era, and it's a nice like transformation of the concept. You know, it's not a direct remake like King Kong '05 that keeps all of the same characters and essentially the same plot. This is more of a taking the concept and kind of transforming the characters and the drive of the plot while keeping the basic, you know, plot summary or plot concept. So your mileage varies based on whether you're into that or not. Those kind of remakes I'm kind of 50-50 on. You know, Halloween, Rob Zombie's Halloween, it's like, oh, if you change it so much, it's almost like you should make a new movie maybe. And then but then Dawn of the Dead 2004, I absolutely like that one more than the original. Uh, I wouldn't say I like this one more than the original, but it does a lot of really cool things.
Yeah, like I said, this is one of the things that this is the film that got me into the King Kong franchise, and I have a lot of fun with it on a rewatch. It's one of the ones I go back to maybe once or twice a year, throw it on to have some fun with it. And it's I mean, clearly with being an adult and working all the time, and you know, I have kids, so I don't have a lot of time to go back to the movies I used to. But like I'm trying to, as my little girl grows up, she like I said before, she's only 3, but she knows who King Kong, Godzilla, you know, she knows who like my childhood like stars were, who I was like in love with the films back in the day. I remember when I was younger, this film got me into I was King Kong. I had a gorilla suit for 2 Halloweens in a row when I was, I don't know, 7 and 8 or 6 and 7. My there was a gorilla mask, and then my mom ended up like making an entire suit with like the fur and stuff and out of it. And the Halloweens back then, you know, they weren't as cold as they are now, but they were definitely a little chilly, and I was sweating in that thing. So I definitely had some love for King Kong because of this film. Why don't I go ahead and get into a little of the background and behind the scenes information on the film, and we'll keep on trucking along.
That sounds good.
King Kong is a 1976 American monster adventure film produced by Dino De Laurentiis and directed by John Gillerman. It is a modernized remake of the 1933 film about a giant ape that is captured and taken to New York City for exhibition. It stars Jeff Bridges, Charles Grodin, and Jessica Lange in her first film role, and features mechanical effects by Carl Ramboldi and makeup effects by Rick Baker, who also played the title character. It is the 5th entry in the King Kong franchise, and the idea to remake King Kong was conceived by Michael Eisner, who was then an ABC executive, in 1974. He separately proposed the idea to Universal Studios CEO Sidney Sheinberg and Paramount Pictures CEO Barry Diller. Italian producer Dino De Laurentiis quickly acquired the film rights from RKO General and subsequently hired television writer Lorenzo Semple Jr. to write the script. John Gillerman was hired as director, and filming lasted from January to August in 1976 before the film's release. Universal Pictures sued De Laurentiis and RKO General, alleging breach of contract and attempting to develop their own remake of King Kong. In response, De Laurentiis and RKO General filed separate countersuits against Universal Pictures. All of them were withdrawn by January 1976. And then this film was released on December 17th, 1976, to mixed reviews from film critics while being a modest success at the box office. It won a non-competitive Special Achievement Academy Award for Best Visual Effects, and it was also nominated for Best Cinematography and Best Sound. Of the 3 King Kong main films, it is the only one to feature the World Trade Center instead of the Empire State Building, and a sequel titled King Kong Lives was released 10 years later in 1986, with Gillerman directing once again. So there's a little background on the film.
Yeah, and you know, in some of the research I was doing for the movie, I learned that, you know, according to Dino De Laurentiis, he disputes that Eisner was the first one to come up with the idea. He tries to say that the initial idea of the remake came from himself seeing a poster of the movie in his daughter's bedroom or something like that, and then all of those lawsuits and countersuits is part of the sort of weird legal history of King Kong, of how it's kind of not really in the public domain, but kind of almost is in the public domain and can kind of be used in this weird kind of way. Like, and the same thing with the lawsuit that I think was brought to Nintendo over Donkey Kong. Like, I think that was also like, it's all part of this weird history where King Kong now exists in this weird spot where you could be having the MonsterVerse movies getting made, but also Disney is apparently trying to make some kind of TV series that's adapting some kind of King Kong books or something like that. It's a weird kind of area. And what was I going to say? They originally settled for an agreement that both Paramount and Universal would be able to make their movie, that Paramount would be able to make this movie, and no sooner than 18 months later, Universal would be able to make their King Kong movie, which at the time was called The Legend of King Kong. And, that eventually was delayed out, and it was going to be the 90s King Kong that was also going to be directed by Peter Jackson. But then that project fell apart, and then that eventually became the 2005 King Kong directed by Peter Jackson. So weird long history there.
It is. And, I'm glad that this film doesn't really show any effects of that. It doesn't turn into like a cheesy, terrible movie over like the some rights battles and whatnot. I'm glad King Kong didn't turn into what we have today with Friday the 13th, where we haven't gotten a movie for 15 years, or that would be terrible. I would definitely veto that.
Yeah, and evidently the purported Universal film at the time, Legend of King Kong, was going to be a much more faithful adaptation. So it wouldn't have quite been the same thing as when I believe there was a year that 2 competing James Bond movies released, and one with Connery and one with Roger Moore. It wouldn't have quite been that, because there would have been at least a year and a half between movies. But could you imagine like a 1978 or 1980 Universal Legend of King Kong movie so shortly after this one? Would have been interesting.
And that one would have just been a standalone as well.
Yeah, you would think.
I did not know that about that film, The Legend of King Kong. I had not heard that, so I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, it was interesting to learn about myself, because that it's essentially kind of the initial origin of how Universal ended up making the 2005 film. Like, it's like the legal loophole or nugget that allowed that to happen, I guess.
All right, well, I might have to. I'm always interested in stuff like that, so I might have to do some more digging and see what else I can find. I like reading up on stuff like that. Why don't I go ahead and get into a trailer for the film, get in a plot synopsis, and we'll come back and discuss the numbers, the fun facts, and all of our good stuff.
Sounds good.
(1976). The American merchant vessel Petrox Explorer has just set sail from the port of Surabaya in search of oil. What they find will shock the world.
We may be sailing into the history books.
They will catch a stowaway.
And landing on the beach of the Skull, where he heard the roar of the greatest beast.
They will rescue a beautiful castaway.
She's alive!
Maybe my luck has changed.
And they will discover an uncharted island that is the home of the most incredible creature on the face of the earth. A creature called Kong. Dino De Laurentiis and Paramount Pictures present the most exciting original motion picture event of all time. King Kong. King Kong, a fantastic adventure.
Open the gate!
King Kong, a colossal achievement. King Kong, a motion picture filled with sights and sounds unlike anything you've ever experienced before. King Kong.
Don't flood the tank! She fell in!
With Jeff Bridges, Charles Grodin, and introducing Jessica Lange as the beauty who charmed the beast. And starring the eighth wonder of the world, King Kong.
In the 1970s, Fred Wilson, an executive of the Petrox Oil Company, forms an expedition based on infrared imagery which reveals a previously undiscovered Indian Ocean island hidden by a permanent cloud bank. Wilson believes the island has a huge deposit of oil. Jack Prescott, a primate paleontologist, sneaks onto the expedition's vessel and attempts to warn the team against traveling to the island, citing an ominous final message about the roar of the greatest beast from previous doomed explorers. Wilson orders Prescott locked up, assuming that he is a spy from a rival corporation. Wilson eventually makes Prescott the expedition's photographer. The ship happens upon a life raft which carries the beautiful and unconscious Dwan. Upon waking, Dwan tells Prescott that she is an aspiring actress who was aboard a director's yacht which suddenly exploded. During the rest of the ship's voyage, Prescott and Dwan become attracted to each other. Upon arriving at the island, the team discovers a primitive tribe of indigenous people who live within the confines of a gigantic wall, built to protect them from a mysterious god known as Kong. The team finds that while there is a large deposit of oil, it is of such low quality that it is unusable. Later, while Dwan is on a raft, the natives kidnap her and take her back to the island where they drug her and offer her as a sacrifice to Kong. The monumental ape grabs Dwan from the altar and departs back into the jungle. Although an awesome and terrifying sight, the soft-hearted Kong quickly becomes tamed by Dwan, whose rambling monologue calms and fascinates the monstrous beast. After she falls in the mud, Kong takes Dwan to a wonderful waterfall to wash herself and then uses great gusts of his warm breath to dry her. In the meantime, Prescott and First Mate Carnahan lead a rescue mission to save Dwan. The rescue party encounters Kong while crossing a log bridge over a ravine, and Kong rolls the huge log, sending Carnahan and the rest of the sailors falling to their deaths. Prescott and Bone are the only ones to survive. Kong takes Dwan to his lair. A gigantic snake appears and attempts to eat Dwan, but Kong battles and kills it while Prescott escapes with Dwan. Kong chases them back to the native village only to fall into a pit trap and be smothered with chloroform. Without any of the promised new oil, Wilson decides to transport Kong to America as a promotional gimmick for his company. When they finally reach New York City, Kong is put on display in a Beauty and the Beast farce, bound in chains with a large crown on his head. When Kong sees a group of reporters crowding around Dwan, hoping for interviews, the ape thinks it's an assault on Dwan and breaks free of his bonds and goes on a rampage throughout the city. In the commotion, Wilson is killed when Kong steps on him. The ape also destroys an elevated train in his search for Dwan. Prescott and Dwan flee across the Queensboro Bridge to Manhattan while Kong pursues them. Prescott calls the military, and in return for a promise that Kong will be captured unharmed, he tells them that Kong will climb the World Trade Center, which resembles a mountain on his native island. Kong locates Dwan and takes her, and he begins to make his way to the World Trade Center with Jack and the military in hot pursuit. In the climax, Kong climbs the South Tower of the World Trade Center. After being attacked by men with flamethrowers while standing on the roof, Kong leaps across to the North Tower. Then he is attacked and shot by military helicopters while Dwan is trying to stop them. The fatally injured Kong falls from the roof of the World Trade Center Plaza, where he dies from his injuries. Dwan is bombarded by a sea of photographers. The crowd is so big though that Dwan cannot even get close to Jack. She stands still and is photographed relentlessly by reporters while Kong lies dead in a pool of blood and broken concrete. All right, let's jump into some quick numbers on the 76 King Kong. This film had a budget of $24 million and a box office return of $90.6 million. And Chris has our inflation numbers for that.
So yes, a $24 million budget in 1976 would be about $133 million in modern times, and then a $90.6 million box office return would be about $502.3 million in modern times.
So it didn't do bad for itself. It tripled a little bit more than tripled its budget. And I honestly thought this film was bigger than that when I was younger because it was always on TV when I was younger, and like I said, I was always renting it. I had friends who were always renting it, so it might not have done that well in theaters per se, but I'm guessing like the video store rentals and stuff like that. I'm thinking it might have made a bit of money there.
Yeah, and for that time, that was still a big commercial success, relatively speaking. So yeah, that was still a hit at the time. Like, just because it wasn't on the sort of Jaws level of, Jaws was an all time, was the number one movie when it came out. It wasn't on that level, but to have a $20 million budget and a gross 90 million, that's very, very strong, because apparently the television broadcast rights went for another $20 million, and I believe that's where the extended TV cut of this movie comes from, because they added in the better part of like 30-40 minutes of deleted scenes into the movie, and they split the movie across 2 nights of broadcast. So it had, back in those days, things like your TV rights deals were much more lucrative, because there were fewer, video and things like that were just less common and less spread out. So the film did very well. It just wasn't the sort of, I feel like it was, and we'll get into this a little bit later, I feel like it was molded in the model of Jaws, and maybe expected to be that level of hit, and it wasn't that huge, but it was still a pretty big success.
Quick question for you before I continue on with some numbers. Have you watched that? I believe it's like a 170-minute version of this film, or it's close to 3 hours.
Well, I unless it was one, because there was one time that I saw this movie when I was a kid and it was broadcast on TV. I don't have a recollection of that being a 2 night broadcast, but for all I know, at that point they were still broadcasting the super long version. It was just all in one sitting, but I could not tell you off of memory alone if I saw that longer version. I know as an adult, sort of, you know, because that was around when the 2005 movie was coming out, was when I was able to see the broadcast of this one. And outside of that, we only ever rented it as a kid from the, Blockbuster Video. And then when I watched it as an adult before Kong Skull Island, that was definitely the regular version, and this time was the regular version. So I don't know if I've ever seen the longer version at all.
Okay, I was just curious because I bought the like special edition Blu-ray that was released that has that version on it. I just haven't watched it yet. I started it and
Okay.
I didn't get through it. Like I said, I've seen this movie so many times that I was like, do I
Yeah.
really care to see the extra 40 minutes of deleted scenes? But it's like one of these days I think I'll have to get to it and see what the difference is.
Yeah, nothing against the movie. I don't know if I love the movie enough to want a 3 hour cut of it.
I understand that completely. Why don't I'll continue with some numbers here. IMDb rates this film a 6 out of 10. It has a 55% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, 61% rating on Metacritic, and 70% of Google users liked this film. So our Google users didn't do us too much justice. They were actually
Yeah,
pretty
they're
fair
a
with this
little
film.
they're a little soft on it.
And that's all right because I wouldn't say this is in for compared to all the monster movies in the world. Is it an A? I don't know. There's some Godzilla films that are up there that are an A. It's hard to be an A, but I think in my opinion, this is at least like a C plus, B minus type of King Kong film. It's up there for me in the Kong franchise.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with that. It has the stuff that it does well, it does really well, and then the stuff that's kind of it changes up. Again, your mileage may vary, but I think there's some odd adjustments. And we'll get as we talk about more aspects of the movie, we'll get a little bit more into that.
Absolutely. Here's some of the stuff that saves the film for me, because there are some things I don't like about it. But King Kong is on screen for 28 minutes and 12 seconds, or about 21% of the film, with his first appearance being at just under 53 minutes, or about 39% into the film. So for a 2 hour and I think without the ending credits, it's like 2 hours and 12 minutes or somewhere right around there. I will definitely take 28 minutes of King Kong screen time.
Yeah, well, and that's the beauty when you when you have a suit and you build an animatronic and it's all practical effects. Once you have the physical creature built, you can film it for as much as you want at no additional cost. It's not like a CGI model where every frame that you render takes time and money and man hours and design work and direction and fine tuning. It isn't like the old suit days where you put all the money in up front on building the super expensive suit, and then you could film that thing for an hour straight if you wanted to. So it's a whole different dynamic in that these movies, the production methods allowed them to technically put the thing on screen as long as they wanted. And it's interesting that you say it's about 53-minute mark when he shows up, because give or take, I think what the 2005 film, I actually think it's closer to like the 70-minute mark, something, or 60 something 70-minute, but that's a 3-hour movie. And so I think percentage wise, showing up about 50 something minutes into a 2-hour movie is percentage wise later than showing up about 60 70 minutes in a 3-hour movie. So it's like all these complaints about, oh my gosh, it took forever to get to King Kong in the 2005 film, but it's like that seems about on par with relative to the runtime with about where he shows up in this movie.
Do you want me to spoil a quick comparison for you, or should I?
Sure, yeah, go ahead and knock that out. Let's settle
So
this.
in the 2005 film, you're absolutely right on. He shows up at an hour and 10 minutes in, which is 35% into that film compared to 39% into this film.
Okay, well there you go. See, I thought my instincts might have been right on that.
Chris knows his movies. I'll hop over to some fun facts for you, because I got quite a few of these before we get into all the good stuff with our favorite character and scene and whatnot. The 76 King Kong was advertised as the most exciting original motion picture event of all time, despite being a remake to the 1933 film.
Yeah, I saw that in one of the videos I was watching about it. They had that, like the clip of that advertisement, and it's like it's like that's very funny. How dare you call a remake of one of the classics an original concept? But I guess coming from the sense that they're basically taking the concept, and the bones of the plot, and then like they're redoing all of the characters, they're redoing all of the motivations, they're redoing the time setting and even the iconography of the building and all of that, and the way the island's executed. Like in all essence, but the plot, I suppose it might as well be a remake in the same way that we mentioned, like the Dawn of the Dead 2004 or the Rob Zombie Halloween.
Well, and then the 33 film, to people that were probably born in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, this was that original motion picture King Kong, because most of them probably hadn't seen that 33 film that were born 30 years later and so on.
Yeah, there was simultaneously less familiarity, I think, with classic films because you didn't have that home market where everyone could watch almost anything all the time. So there might have been less of a familiarity with it, but probably held in higher reverence. In the way that that kids could grow up hearing about King Kong in the 40s, and then it's re-released in theaters in the 50s, and that re-release makes more money than it did in the 30s, you know. So that kind of gives us like cultural like legend status to some of these movies. And you know, they put out Gone with the Wind like every 5 years, and it would make another big chunk of change, you know. And so it was kind of probably revered a little bit more. And I think at the time the idea of remaking it was still seen as a little bit of a like a a, a disgraceful kind of idea. But you know, they I could also see, you know, from the sort of producer side of it, when you're talking about a 1930s black and white movie, with the perception being, you know, in the 70s, a lot of darker movies were kind of very popular and taking over until the latter part of the decade. So the perception being like, oh, you know, that black and white movie is kind of that black and white movie's silly, and it has monsters in it, and it's really unrealistic, and it's kind of goofy. That being the perception of the producers, and then saying, well, we're gonna do King Kong by way of Jaws. You know, Jaws just became the biggest movie ever. We're gonna do King Kong that way, where it's realistic and it's modern and it's grounded, and you have King Kong and maybe like one other creature, but it's going to be kind of dark and it'll be kind of violent, you know, and a little more, you know, risque, and have a bit more sex appeal overtly, you know. Like, I could just see the gears turning in the producers' heads of all the ways that they're not thinking the original's bad, but just seeing all of the ways you could modernize it and change it and update it. Be like, oh, we're not making a movie, it's an oil company, you know, like all of that. And just like they think it's just genius, and they don't really understand that it's like some people prefer more reverence for an original, you know.
Absolutely. Very, very well said. Very well said. The posters for the American release of Godzilla vs. Megalon featured Godzilla and Megalon battling atop the World Trade Center as an attempt to cash in on this film's release. So, kind of like a little cash grab for them as well.
Yeah, they've always been intermingled. You know, I always think it's funny to notice that, you know, the initial Godzilla series ended in 1975, and the next year you have King Kong, and then in 2004 that series of Godzilla films ended, and the next year you had a King Kong movie. I always found that very interesting.
Absolutely. And of course, the original Kong being an
Oh,
inspiration for the 54 Godzilla. So,
yeah, predating it by 2 decades. Yep.
absolutely. For shots of King Kong holding Jessica Lange's character, the filmmakers built giant hydraulic gorilla arms. The hands were 6 feet across and the arms weighed 1,650 pounds each. They weren't ready until shooting was well underway, and when they were finally built, Dino De Laurentiis was invited to the set to witness a test. He walked into the studio and a giant arm extended in his direction. Then the middle finger slowly uncurled and extended itself, and De Laurentiis broke up. So did the arm. It was frozen finger up for a week.
That's great. That's fantastic. Almost the spirit of Kong flipping a bird to the production.
This isn't my movie.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
The 40-foot Kong scene when they are showing him in New York was constructed with a 3.5-ton aluminum frame covered with rubber and just over 1,000 pounds of Argentinian horsetails sewn into place individually. Its insides were compromised. Sorry. Ugh. Its
Comprised.
insides were comprised of 3,100 feet of hydraulic hose and 4,500 feet of electrical wiring, and it was controlled by 20 operators, and it cost a total of $1.7 million in 1976.
Phew, yeah. That is one thing, you know, from what I understand, this was one of the most expensive films of all time when it happened. And you know, they definitely, you know, it was definitely a very extravagant, you know, event kind of film. Like I said, I get the sense, you know, thinking about how Jaws was the year before, I just get such a sense that they were wanting to kind of that this was King Kong by way of Jaws from their perspective, from the perspective of the producers, you know.
Yeah, they did go big with this film, and I when you're a kid, like I said, I loved this movie. I was so big on it because I grew up watching this and Jaws, and I was constantly going back between this and Jaws, and like the Halloween films once I got a little bit older and stuff like that. But it's even nowadays, I have so much nostalgia, and like I remember all this from my childhood and stuff. So this is still one of like my favorite Kong films. And I see like in the Godzilla group chat and stuff, like I see people knocking this film, or I
Mm.
either see them knocking it or absolutely loving it. And it's just like I'm on the side of loving it just because I grew up with this one a lot.
Yeah, I think outside of some of the composite shots have aged pretty roughly. But generally speaking, I think the suitmation stuff and the animatronic stuff holds up quite well. Um, they kind of go a little. It's a little, I've seen people try to call the movie creepy in the way that it sexualizes the Dwan character. Like, dude, I mean, I think some people are a little oversensitive to that. Yes, she's very attractive, and yes, the movie is showing her off a lot. But I think modern audiences are a little overly sensitive to that sort of thing. Like the whole concept of King Kong is it's the beauty and the beast concept. So they're showing off her beauty, and like they went a bit more with that sort of romantic vibe, which yeah, it's a little weird because you can't really have like a genuine romance between a giant monster and a woman, and so it gets a little, it gets a little like kind of pervy and weird and whatnot. Like when he's blowing her off after she's been put under the waterfall, or or whatever. It's like yeah, it gets a little weird, but I think. I think it was just in an effort to kind of give the movie a different kind of feel and vibe from the original. I think some people are a little bit too you know, a little too sensitive to some of it.
That's with everything nowadays, but we won't get into that. We're just here to talk about a movie we like.
Exactly, exactly. No, I'm gonna rant on it for 35 minutes.
The World Trade Center sequence was filmed twice for a total cost of nearly $250,000. An August 1976 edition of Cinemaphile noted that the throng of approximately 45,000 background personnel was the largest crowd seen in motion picture history to date during that World Trade Center scene.
Yeah, and they called for I think 5,000 extras and volunteers for it, and then about like anywhere from 30 to 40,000 showed up.
Which is ridiculous.
Yeah, yeah, and I do think that as much as it seems like of the moment, because I'm pretty sure the World Trade Center was fairly new at this time, or at least the time when they made the decision. Uh, I do think that's a bit one of the more kind of inspired, kind of interesting choices about it. Like, yes, we no longer have the World Trade Center, so it's unique in that way. But the idea of putting it there so that you could have him jumping from one to the other, that is a great, unique visual. So I think that was a pretty inspired, creative choice, on the part of the filmmakers.
The World Trade Centers, I was just looking something up quick because I knew about it. They were built between 1966 and 1975. So they were almost brand newly
Yeah,
finished when
yeah,
this
that's
film.
that's very interesting. That's very interesting.
Dino De Laurentiis approached Ray Harryhausen about providing the stop motion effects for Kong in this film, and Harryhausen turned him down as he felt that 12 months wasn't sufficient time to deliver on such a detailed shoot.
Man, that would have been, gosh, to see them go with stop motion for this movie would have been very interesting because some of the stuff that I watched implied that there was a perception on the filmmaker's side, not necessarily the producer, that stop motion, that it was perceived as being kind of outdated and that they wanted to do it differently. So it's interesting to hear that they offered Harryhausen the job, and then maybe when he said no, they're like, oh well, that stuff's cheap and outdated anyway. We'll just do it another way. Maybe that was just a bit of pride on the filmmaker's part when he turned him down, because something tells me that they, clearly they probably would have loved to. When I was a young kid, I knew that Ray Harryhausen was like the stop motion guy. When I was a very young kid, I assumed that the original was a Ray Harryhausen movie, and then only when I got a little older, I actually learned that it predated all that stuff. So that was actually a bit of a learning curve for me. But it would have been fantastic to see a late '70s Ray Harryhausen King Kong stop motion animation. Would have been amazing.
Yeah, 43 years, it would just I would have been curious to see how they did it, like how the advancements would have worked if it
Yeah,
would have been something just like the 33 film or how they actually would have
yeah.
done the stop motion in this.
Yeah, or even if it had been, a mix and match of maybe they had some suit stuff, some animatronic stuff, some puppets, and then some stop motion stuff. Like if it would have been like a hodgepodge of all the methods, that would have been interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's an interesting one. Since we've mentioned Jaws so many times, Steven Spielberg was considered to direct this film.
I'm telling you, man, they wanted that Jaws energy.
I mean, I wouldn't have objected at a young
Yeah, I
age.
mean, yeah, who wouldn't
Who
have
would
at
have?
that point? It became the biggest movie of all time. Same thing after Star Wars that everybody wanted their Star Wars. So there you go.
He could have had the definitive shark, dinosaur, and ape film.
Oh man, in a world where Steven Spielberg had said yes, because he probably could have wrote his own ticket at that time.
Oh, I'm sure. After Jaws, I'm sure he would have
Yeah.
had a $75 million budget back then or something like that,
Yeah.
compared to
They
24.
they certainly would have given him whatever he wanted, that's for sure.
Absolutely. King Kong 76. This was the seventh highest grossing film of 1976. So it did well for itself, as we said before.
Mhm.
And then my last one for you here is just a kind of fun one. After Kong snatches Dwan, Prescott points to the fallen trees and snaps, "What do you think did that? A guy in an ape suit?" Of course, that is of course exactly what happened. Presumably, this was filmed fairly like early on, and then when it was still believed that the ill-fated 40-foot robot would be doing most of the Kong scenes. So it wasn't supposed
Yeah.
to be a man in a suit, but that's what it turned out to be. So it's
Yeah,
a
the
nice little
40
fun
the
moment.
40-foot robot that I believe is only in like seconds of the movie, it was kind of a shame.
Yes, he's I mean, if you watch the film, you can tell it's when he escapes from the cage they have
Yeah.
where they're
Uh-huh.
presenting Kong and he likes the robot slowly or the animatronic slowly raises its arm up, and I think that's
Yeah.
about really almost all you see of it.
Yeah, and I think it was much more like I'm sure they would have loved to do plenty with it. You don't spend $1 million on the thing without having big intentions, but in the end, it seems like it played out more like just like a grandiose publicity stunt. To be like, oh my gosh, we have a life size robot, and then the thing is in seconds of footage.
Yeah, and that 40-foot Kong cost a very pretty penny in this film.
Hmm.
It was
And you,
ridiculous amount for back then to use for not even a full scene in the film. So
yeah,
I wonder
and
I
you
wonder
would have thought, like, gosh, and again, and far be it from me to challenge their creativity, but if you have that 40-foot thing, like, even when, even in a setup where maybe Kong's not moving, where he's maybe still like partly sedated before he's waking up in the chains, maybe you try to at least get some mileage of some cool shots, like some helicopter shots or some nice shots where people are sort of up close to it, where you're not doing composites, like use it in a way where you're still getting like the production value of it being life size, like that would have been really, at least then you're getting a little bit more of your money's worth.
absolutely, and I'm like I said, for to spend so much money on that, I think it was like a $2 million animatronic, and to be seen for 15-20 seconds of the film is that it's
Yeah.
just a shame.
Yeah, that could have been money spent better somewhere else.
Absolutely. That is all I have for you on the fun facts. This is another film I could have went for an hour on these, but I just chose a few couple. So, Chris, why don't I turn to you and see who your favorite character was of the film?
I went with outside of King Kong, which I think everyone would want to pick. I went with Jack Prescott. Part of it is for me is that this is for me personally, for a very, very long time, this was the youngest I ever saw Jeff Bridges at. For me growing up, a lot, Jeff Bridges was always an old guy in movies, whether it be Big Lebowski or Tron Legacy or Iron Man. Jeff Bridges was always older in the movies I watched. So to see a 1970s Jeff Bridges was really interesting. You know, it a lot of the performance in this movie are a little like there's like good and bad, or like good and awkward, and like it's kind of a weirdly, it's a unique movie in some ways, and the way it kind of hits the tone, the tone kind of swings around a little bit, but I liked, Jack Prescott. He's a morph of Jack Driscoll from the original, but instead of the first mate, he's more of this environmentalist, ape primate expert. So it's sort of for the 70s. It was the modern spin on the character. He's against the oil company and all of that, and he's trying to preserve Kong's life, and he's rooting for Kong in the climax of the movie, which is unique because Kong's like straight up murdering people, and he's like, yeah, so it's like it's a unique dynamic. But yeah, I mean, he's a solid protagonist, so he was my favorite.
I can't argue against him. I'm sure our listeners will judge me for this one, but out of like nostalgia and like having like a huge crush for her when I was younger, I went with Dwan and Jessica Lange's character. She was just this like spunky, like outgoing, like girl or like woman in the film. And I had fun with her, and I like how like she's scared of Kong at first, like wants nothing to do with him. She's trying to get away, and she eventually like doesn't like fall for the beast or like fall for Kong, but genuinely like cares about him, like he's being killed, and like she's crying, and like she delivers like very good emotion in this film, I think. But I just had fun with her. And then of course Jack, he's right there neck and neck with her. And I think I just went back to having like the childhood crush, she was
Yeah,
one of the
I
like
mean,
original girls that I just had the
yeah,
hots for.
she's gorgeous. There's no denying that. And generally speaking, most normal ladies who are that gorgeous tend to be a little bit on the ditzy side. Tend to be, they can be a little airheaded, not always, but sometimes. So they're giving her that kind of like that ditzy airheaded kind of vibe. And yes, I can understand that some people might find that annoying, but it's probably, you know, a gorgeous would-be actress in the 70s would probably have a personality that was a little bit like that. Sometimes they maybe push it too far, but like it's not totally, off base.
Well, she's as a young kid, you have like your first couple like crushes, like a lot of
Princess
kids were
Leia.
like Kimberly, the Pink Ranger from Power
Oh,
Rangers,
yeah,
or
yeah,
this
yeah, yeah.
girl or this girl,
Uh-huh.
like Dwan was
Uh-huh.
one of mine.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, good lordy. I think, the Dwan name, I know they make a point of it where she's like, "Oh, it's like Dawn, but with the two letters switched to make it more memorable." You hear stories, when Game of Thrones is popular, you heard about how there was a surge in baby names after some of the characters, particularly like the female characters in the show. And I feel like this movie was maybe hoping that there would be a wave of new babies being named Dwan, but I don't think that ended up happening.
Oh, I'll go ahead. I'll give you my favorite score for the film, and I honestly there was like two that I kind of went back and forth with, and one was like just the opening of the film, how it kind of like sets the tone that this isn't like a standout score for the film or anything like that. It's honestly just to me kind of like a lot of background noise, but some of the soundtracks set the scene for the film and stuff like that. They're very good background tones for me and background sounds. So I ended up choosing the opening, how it kind of goes with how they're making their way out to sea. I liked that one, and then the climb to Skull Island, where he actually is climbing the trade centers and like making his way to like his doom or his death. I liked those two scores in the film.
Mhm. Uh, Good tracks. Yeah, it's a little bit. You can tell they're kind of going for this kind of like sweeping, almost like romantic epic kind of a thing. Like they were going for big with this movie. They were certainly aiming for some high heights. Uh, I like the track. It's Nightwall 3 and Celebration, or Nightwall and Celebration, but it was kind of designated as 3 of 3. So like I don't know if that's one huge track and this is just the final third of it, but it's essentially when it's Kong's arrival at the wall to take Dwan, and it's just a good atmosphere that builds up to Kong's first appearance very, very well. So that was my favorite piece of music. I also liked, I think there was a track listed as church organ, which is, Kong in the city, and and like the priest sees him, and it's playing like this church organ, but they let this music go for like a good like 40 seconds as like Kong's going through the city and things like that, and it's just like this really cinematic moment that I liked. But so those are my two tracks that I dug a lot.
Yeah, the one where they're getting ready to give Dwan away, and like they are kind of like the natives are kind of like rocking out on like the drums per se, and like
Yeah.
chanting like the Kong like
Hmm.
that. That was a hard one not to choose for me, and
Hmm.
that one is just like it's all around an epic scene because you're like what 45, 48 minutes into the film, and you know that Kong's coming, and you're finally getting like
Yeah,
the big entrance of the title character. So like that was
indeed.
done very well in my opinion.
Agreed.
What was your favorite quote or most memorable line from the film? This should
Uh,
be good.
yeah, the dialogue in this movie is really unique, and I know we keep bringing up this Jaws comparison, but I feel like because when Jaws was such a huge, not to go on a rant here, but when Jaws was such a huge hit, there's so many there's like every other line of dialogue in that movie feels kind of iconic, like even random lines like, "Oh, that's some bad hat Harry," or "Here's the man who goes swimming with bow-legged women." Like it just feels like every other line of dialogue in that movie is just like kind of iconic and memorable in some ways. And I feel like this was written in a way where they were kind of trying to do that. Like they were trying to have all these like unique phrases and one-offs or unique way of saying things, and it sometimes doesn't feel like how people talk, uh Dwan has this line where she's talking about, the baby's born during the black, or after the black, 9 months after the blackout, and she's like, "Here's to all the sons and daughters of King Kong." It's like, were they trying to make people like repeat that line in pop culture a lot? I don't know, but the line that I ended up going with was when she says, "I had my horoscope done before I flew out to Hong Kong, and it said that I was going to cross over water and meet the biggest person in my life." And I'm a sucker for cheesy pun lines like that, and interesting foreshadowing like that. I can't help it. I like lines like that. So I liked her, getting to meet the biggest person in her life.
Absolutely. That line always gives me like a little smile just because I know what it's leading up to. And I feel like
Hmm.
most people that know the Kong story, he takes the girl. So most people know that line with what it's leading up to and what it's foreshadowing.
Hmm.
I went with a simple line from Fred Wilson where they're getting ready to try to trap Kong, and he looks at the guy Bone, who was one of the only him and Jack were the only survivors when Kong actually like takes the log and like twists it and throws it over the edge and kills everyone. And he looks at him and he goes, "You sure that monkey will be able to bust through that gate?" And Bone just looks at him and kind of goes, "Uh-huh." Like, yeah, bud, like I absolutely know. Like he's gonna get through that gate. And it just
Yeah.
gives me a laugh every time because Fred Wilson he hasn't seen Kong. He doesn't know how big he is or anything. And Bone, he's seen like the beast, in all its glory, killing all of his other like crew members, and
Yeah.
so he just kind of gives him a look and a huh. And I always love that line because like everyone that's watching the movie knows what's coming, and Fred Wilson is just still like this cocky, arrogant guy about it.
Indeed. Uh, and it's always funny to bring up the whole wall debate with these King Kong movies. Is like, do they build it to keep King Kong in, but then it seems like he's kind of sometimes would be strong enough to go over it or break through it, or was it sort of built as just like a position of like worship and offering for Kong? Like, it's always an interesting dynamic to start to talk about, like, the purpose and reasoning and placement of the wall in a King Kong movie, because it's just such a piece of the iconography. But yeah, that's a good moment.
That that goes along with one of the scenes I like in this film. It wasn't my favorite, so I'll give you my favorite first, and then I'll give you I got a one or two little honorable mentions I like. And I know it's like a lot of people don't like this scene that I've seen, and definitely my daughter's mom. She is not a fan of this movie because of this scene. But it's when Kong climbs the trade centers and the choppers just annihilate him, and
No, that's also my favorite scene in the movie for probably the same reasons.
it's just like balls to the wall. Like uh, the emotion that Dwan is like trying to get Kong to like pick her back up to like kind of like in a way save his life, and the choppers are just going at him, and it's a very brutal. Like, we don't get a lot of brutal King Kong deaths in these films. It's usually like, yeah, he's shot a couple times and then he falls off the building. But this one is there's blood spurting everywhere, and it's just the choppers are just
Yeah.
relentless against him.
Yeah, as a kid, it scarred me a little bit because there's so much just like blood spraying, and it's such like a brutal death. It feels very much, not to put too much weight on the movie, but it feels very much like this kind of like animal slaughter kind of a scene, and distressed animals it's a tough, for some reason it's a tough thing for me to watch, like, because their awareness isn't as high. So like when an animal's like in pain or getting hurt or dying, like they don't really understand the nature of what's going on, like, and so it always just I just have extra sympathy for them, because it's like he's like getting shot at, and like he probably doesn't even really get it, and so like it just feels so much more like, brutal and vicious and heartless, and the blood spurting of it, and it always was just like, it just felt like a very dark scene, and it was always hard for me to watch as a kid.
Well, yeah, and then this guy is the king of his island. There's nobody who even can match his strength or power. So he sees these guys coming, and he takes them as a threat, and he gets shot. And you can see the first time he gets shot, he like roars, and he's like, "What the hell was that?" Like he doesn't know what's happening, and he ends up taking a couple of the choppers out,
Mhm.
and like I just like the scene because, like I said, Dwan is very emotional, and every time Kong gets a hit on a chopper, Jax, he's looking up and he's cheering and he's rooting for Kong because earlier in the film he wanted them to trap Kong and net him to get him back
Mhm.
to his island, and they completely double cross him and end up killing him instead. And I it was easily one of my favorite scenes in the film. I don't look forward to it, but when it
Yeah.
comes on screen, I always remember it as like something I watched a lot as a kid, or
Yeah.
went back to.
Yeah, and likewise, my mom. I remember when Kong Skull Island came out, and I told my mom and her husband, I'm like, oh yeah, it's good. You should check it out. Like, her first thing, she's like, they don't kill him at the end of this one, do they? Like it like breaks her heart when King Kong dies. So I get it.
No, yeah, I mean it is sad because he's just trying to take care, and he thinks you're a threat to the woman that he has, so he's trying to take care of you before you get to her. So I mean,
Yeah, and he's not in his natural environment. He's in a strange place, and getting killed for it.
one of the other scenes, I mean, there's a couple of them. Is we didn't get any T Rexes or anything in this film, which suck. We didn't get any really big battles, but we did get the battle with Kong, and I believe it was like a large boa or a large python in the film. I think when I
Hmm.
looked it up, it was labeled as a boa, and I mean that's a quick little fun fight where we get the iconic, the callback where Kong snaps the jaws open.
Oh,
Granted,
and we get
it's not.
arguably the most brutal depiction of that.
Yeah, and it's not as effective because it's a snake and not a dinosaur. But I mean easily had to be a couple 100-foot long snake compared to like a 50, 60-foot King Kong.
Yeah, and that was a brutal, like when he rips its jaws open, and like that's it's a great moment of brutality, and that's also my second favorite scene. Oh man, I would have loved to see this film populated with at least a handful of dinosaur-like creatures for the characters and Kong to encounter. I know they were sort of going for like Kong as the anomaly, and they put the snake in there kind of just as a nod to it. That was their '70s mentality of like, well, he fights a T-Rex in the original, but we got to be a bit more realistic. Why doesn't he just fight a giant snake? That feels more plausible. You can see how they probably thought that, but it doesn't hit the same. But the actual death itself is a little cooler because it's a little bit more bloody. But the moment doesn't hit the same.
No, not at all. But it's again, it's still one of those. Back in the VHS tape days or the DVD days early on, that was the King Kong against the choppers and the boa fight was
Hmm.
two of the scenes I always went back to a lot. I did want to mention one more, just quick. And it's when Kong is chasing him back to the village and he actually does break through the wall. It shows that I like that it shows that he's on a mission
Hmm.
and there's nothing that's gonna stop him. And he busts this wall down and he's going crazy. In other words, he's going ape shit in this film. And
Yeah.
he takes that wall down. And this is I come back to this, and this is one of my for the Kong sound, like for his roar that he does. This was my favorite for a long time, and it still might be my favorite for the sound effects of the King Kong roar. I don't know why, but as a
Hmm.
kid and still as a grown adult, I love the roar that he has in this film.
Yeah, it's good sound design, and you've heard a lot of these King Kong roars from this movie specifically be kind of reused as just general monster foley in other various video games or TV shows or this, that, and the other. A little moment that I wanted to point out, not really a scene, but a cameo, is that we recently did the Friday the 13th franchise, and the actor who plays Crazy Ralph in two of those movies, Walt Gorney, he has a little cameo in here as a subway driver. Before he's in the before he's in the Friday the 13th movies, and so I always thought that was fun that Crazy Ralph was driving a subway in this movie.
And that's when Kong attacks the train.
Uh huh. Uh huh.
I did not notice that.
Yeah.
That's a good
Yeah.
call out.
Yeah. Go back and give it another watch. It's Crazy Ralph.
You're going to Skull Island, ain't you? No.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. You're all doomed. I barely survived King Kong.
Right, now I gotta deal with Mrs. Voorhees and Jason
Yeah.
Voorhees.
Exactly.
No, but that's all I have for scenes. I mean, I like a lot in this film. The
Mhm.
where Kong attacks him on the log, where he's sentimental with Dwan. There's a lot in this film where he's like looking sad because he's in like the oil container in the boat or
I
in the
like all this.
ship.
I like all the scenes with Jessica Lange.
Well, of course, Jessica Lange and Kong. I'll get into a little bit something different. What did you think of the Kong design in this film? What did you think of the suit?
I think it's good. I think it strikes that I always refer to Kong that stands more upright as Toho Kong. Like sort of the more, and this is literally a man in the suit like the Toho Kong was. But I always think of that posture and that style of King Kong as being Toho Kong versus the sort of Peter Jackson or 1933 movie that were kind of more Gorilla Kong, I suppose. But this strikes a good tone between being gorilla esque, but not going for like a Mighty Joe Young or King Kong '05 100% just silverback gorilla. Like it's a fine line between kind of a gorilla, but also a gorilla monster. I kind of like King Kong being a little bit more monster than pure gorilla. So I like the kind of the Toho and this kind of take in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I would after seeing this one clearly. Like I'm not 100% sure which one I seen first between like the King Kong versus Godzilla and then this '76 film, but like they would always do close-ups in this film on the Kong face when he's like approaching Dwan to like where he originally takes her from the natives, where they offer her up to him. And then, like I'd go back to the King Kong versus Godzilla, the close-ups on his face, and like it was just like a night and day difference. Like one's just terrible in one film, and I always had a soft spot for the way Kong's like the facial expressions that he can do, like the suit, like the movements of the face in the suit in this film. And I don't know why,
Mhm.
but I always, even when the 2005 film came out, and then like Kong Skull Island and stuff, like all the CG and motion capture and whatnot, I still like the look of this 76 suit. Not so much in the next film. In King Kong Lives, you could tell it's the suit and like the facial features and the look of it is a little different. But I always go back to this one as one of my favorites. I really, I have high praise for this suit when it comes to like the all the suits from like the Godzilla franchise and this one from the
Yeah.
Kong and things like that. I don't know what it is about it, but I have high praise for this one.
Yeah, and the facial animatronics are surprisingly emotive, and surprisingly expressive, for a 1970s movie. So yeah, I always dug it as well.
Absolutely, something about when his eyebrow, when he gets that like mean mug on his face, his eyebrow has come down, and like the nose like twinches up a little bit, and I don't know, just little effects like that for a film that's almost what 50 years old. So I mean, it's got a little soft spot for me.
Yeah.
That is all I have for the 76 King Kong. So why don't I'll give you some final thoughts on it. Clearly you've heard me talk very highly of it. It's one of my favorite Kong films, and once we get to ranking some King Kong films, you'll see how high I put it up on the list out of the 10 that we're going to do. But
Oh wow, yeah. Gosh, I haven't even been thinking about where I'm ranking these films. This will be fun.
I gotta keep your brain working.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But this film, I mean, I always have fun with it. It's very nostalgic for me from, like I said, riding my bike to the video store, renting it all the time, or having my mom or dad take me, and it's one of the movies I pick out. I I love Jessica Lange's character. I like Jack in this film. I even like Fred Wilson. He's the money hungry guy. He's trying to get he's going after the oil on the island, and I can't remember the his like coworker or co-partner's name in this film, where he's like, yeah, it'll be really great oil in about another 10,000 years, and it just kind of kills his whole
Yeah.
vibe.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a fun moment, It's like, well, change of plans.
And it's just a fun film. There's a couple like schlocky moments, there's a couple like little heart turning moments, and I think all in all it's a good film. And again, I would recommend it to anybody who likes Kong. Compared to the other films, the like King Kong Escapes, I would actually recommend this to anyone. It's a King Kong film. It's kind of like a remake, reboot, like a reimagining of the 33. So I would say give this one a watch.
Yeah, it was King Kong for the modern audience if the when the modern audience was 1976. And it's definitely it's kind of a it's not the greatest King Kong movie, but I think certainly not the worst King Kong movie. Uh and it's one of those where King Kong is such a kind of iconic kind of character and piece of pop culture, and there's not, even to this day, there's not, it's not like there's 20 King Kong movies. There's not been done to death, and especially they're separated by so many decades. You got a couple in the 30s, a couple in the 60s, a pair in the 70s and 80s. So each one is kind of aesthetically different in a pretty dramatic way from the previous ones. It's not like you got like we're getting now with the MonsterVerse where it's five in a row, and so they're all kind of very similar in some ways. These are separated by decades often, so it's you get a huge contrast in how they're different and advance and alter from one film to the next. So it's worth watching for that alone, because this is the 70s Kong. You want to see what it was like then, just as you kind of want to see what 30s Kong was like, and what 2005 King Kong was like. And so it's absolutely, even if it doesn't end up being your favorite, your mileage may vary. There might be people that don't that see the 30s one. There's a group of audiences that see the 30s one will be like, oh, that hokey black and white stop motion claymation stuff, like how can anyone take that seriously? This one might be a bit more your vibe. I think that's kind of sacrilege to disrespect the original like that, but again, modern folks will often look upon old stuff as just, and dismiss it. So it's like, well, this one isn't quite so old. It's a little bit more of a 70s vibe. If you're a huge Jaws fan, this is kind of King Kong by way of Jaws in a lot of ways. It's not quite as good, but it's kind of up that alley. So, this might be your flavor of King Kong that you like the most.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. This film did have a sequel, though, that we will be looking at. It had a sequel direct with the same director, John Gillerman, and it was released just over 10 years later, December 19th, 1986, with the title King Kong Lives. So, again, we'll be looking at that one. I know Chris said he hasn't watched that one again in a while. I watched that when I was actually doing research for the episode a couple weeks ago. So I'll probably give it another rewatch before we record that one, and then I probably won't watch it for a while because I've had my fill of King Kong Lives.
Oh, you mean the great reappraisal of it as a masterpiece? Isn't we shouldn't be expecting that?
It it's
We'll keep
not.
people in suspense. How about that?
Yeah, it's not a terrible film. It's definitely a different taste of a King Kong film, but we would definitely appreciate it if you ride along that journey with us while we dive into that film.
That'll be a fun discussion.
Absolutely. So, Chris, thank you for joining me. This is another one of the films that I've always been waiting to talk about. Usually can only talk about them on like fan pages or something like that because clearly, again, I'm a top-notch nerd. But it's nice to actually be able to sit down and talk about it for an hour with someone.
100%.
So again, thank you for joining me on this one. Thanks to anyone who's out there listening. We have King Kong Lives, or the sequel to this film, next week. And until next time.
You sure that monkey will be able to bust through that gate?